Hello, everyone, and welcome back to some more Reddit stories. I'm about to hit 100k, guys, and I'm trying to hit it before the end of the year, so please help me out here. It would really mean so much to me personally. And while you're down there, go ahead and follow my Instagram and join my Discord so we can hang out and talk. Alright, today I wanted to read some stories about some abandoned places. So, pretty interesting. I think so. So let's get right into this. I've just seen my family's abandoned old farm being explored by someone on TikTok. He shouldn't have gone there. It's late. I'm doing my usual, sitting in bed long past the time I need to be asleep, scrolling mindlessly through TikTok. It's a bad habit, I know, but you're here reading Reddit, right? I lazily flick the last watched video away, a cat wearing a helmet fashioned out of a melon, and a live feed takes its place. It's dark, with torches or headlamps making almost a strobing effect in some crusty old building. Ghost hunters or something like that. Not my thing. I raise my finger to scroll again, but at the last second, something catches my eye that stops me dead. The camera pans past a black and white framed photograph on the wall. It's my grandparents on their wedding day. I sit stock still, watching intently as the camera moves forward. I would recognize that photo anywhere, having examined it countless times as a child visiting their farmhouse. It was my favorite picture out of any hanging on their walls. This TikToker couldn't be in my grandparents' old farm, surely? It was true it had been left to fall into a state of despair after their passing. I look at their handle, Abandoned Explorer 305. I make a mental note to click on their page and see where they have been, but for now, cannot bring myself to look away from this feed in case it disappears forever. They move further into the living room. A leather armchair, well worn in its day, but now the cushions were sunken in and the fabric torn beyond repair. The fireplace, exposed stone, and an enormous oak mantle, once the impressive focal point of the room, now warped and cracked. The lucky horseshoes that had hung from it littered the hearth, dull and lifeless. They had always been pride of place over the fire, polished and would glint in the firelight of an evening. The person holding the camera is speaking. I'd hardly noticed as I was so wrapped up in a cloud of nostalgia and outrage at this place being invaded. "There's so many horseshoes around here," he was saying. "There are over door thresholds. There was one laid in the kitchen floor, and these ones look like they used to hang over the fireplace. Now, I know this is a farm and they probably did have horses, but they are just everywhere. Now, everyone knows horseshoes are known as a good luck charm, but unless you're into your folklore, you might not know that they also ward off evil spirits." I roll my eyes. Common knowledge. Another TikToker claiming to be an expert on the paranormal. His observation does set off a small prickle on the back of my neck, though. There were a lot of horseshoes at the farm. I took that bit of knowledge away for future reference. Many years ago, they had horses, but since the advent of modern tractors and farming methods, they were not needed, and neither Granny nor Grandpa had any great love for horses that I was aware of. Granny had always been a tad superstitious, though. Horseshoes, lucky heather, four-leaf clovers, that sort of thing. For the most part, I loved going to stay at Granny and Grandpa's when I was small, apart from going to the bathroom alone. The only bathroom was upstairs at the furthest end of the house from the kitchen or living room. To a kid, it felt like an epic journey. Going up wasn't so bad. Once the door from the living room shut, you would find yourself in the cool, quiet passageway. All sounds of life muffled by the thick wood. The air was so still you could hear a pin drop. You'd walk along, then turn back 180 degrees to go up the stairs. The upstairs landing was split on 2 levels, so you'd step down onto the back landing, then take a right to get into the bathroom. It was going back down that was the problem. Since I was old enough to go to the bathroom unaccompanied, once I turned that corner and got to the top of the stairs, a feeling would hit, like an icy finger in the small of your back. Run. I would run down the stairs and back to the kitchen as quickly as my little legs would carry me. More than that, it was imperative that at no point did I turn and look back up at the landing. Bad things would happen if I looked back. As a child, I couldn't really express these feelings, but now as I remember it, it felt like a creeping black mass seeping out of the walls of that back landing, coalescing, and all it would take to give it a corporeal form would be a terrified look back from a fleeing child. Then I would heave open the wooden door, and it felt like all the color suddenly seeped back into the world, the warmth and noise of a busy family home flooding my senses, like pressing play and the film restarts where it left off. In the live camera feed, they approach that solid oak door. is hanging on one hinge, slightly ajar and swaying almost imperceptibly. I notice before the cameraman says aloud that there is a large cast iron horseshoe, big enough for a Shire horse or a Clydesdale, nailed above the threshold that I don't remember, but it suddenly feels important, like a talisman thrown up in a last-ditch effort to stop something. I grip my phone harder with a clammy hand, positive that they should not go deeper into the bowels of this house. I look at the comments flashing up. It's so creepy. Seriously bad vibes. Did anyone else just see a shadow? With a shaky hand, I start typing a comment telling them not to go in there, to just leave, as if they'll listen to me, just another voice in the throng. In my peripheral vision, as I'm typing, I can see the guy push open the door, which gives way with a creak, and just as I'm about to press send, I hear his sharp intake of breath. "What the?" I hear him whisper. I drop my phone onto the bed in shock. Standing side by side in the passageway are two gaunt figures dressed in nightgowns. They wear preternaturally wide grins, which stretch their papery gray skin taut. Where their eyes belong are only dark pits, what could be boreholes straight into the inky depths of hell itself. Somehow worse than that, Granny and Grandpa were holding hands. It was unmistakably them, despite their demonic manifestation. Though it's only a second, it feels like I stare into those twisted faces for half an eternity. All hell breaks loose on camera. Abandoned Explorer 305 turns on his heels and runs back the way he came. The camera work falls into disarray as he bolts for the exit, but I swear, in that fraction of a second as his phone whips around, the creepily wide grins on their faces turns into a grisly snarl. I am transfixed by my phone screen, listening to the TikTok guy's heavy breathing and watching the torch flit around on the screen, lighting walls and floors at random as he makes a break for it. He's close to the back door as long as he doesn't turn the wrong way. 5 or 6 more paces and he'll be out. Then shockingly loud in the little phone speakers is an ungodly screech which makes me jump about a foot off my bed. Live has ended. The feed has just gone. I tap the screen futilely. Nothing. Did he make it out? I search for his handle on the app and nothing comes up. I sit for a long time just staring into space, heart thumping. I should have commented sooner, as soon as I realized that they were in that house. Maybe that would have stopped them from going any further. A notification pops up on my phone. A direct message on TikTok. Strangely, there's no account name with the message. Come to us. Very direct, no ambiguity there. I sigh and reach for a notebook from my bedside table to cross the latest attempt off the list. Communication with the undead via the internet is a new development. An extra deep grave didn't do the trick. Rocks in their mouths, black salt, holy water from lords, a stake through the heart. Nothing keeps these two restless souls in their grave for long. We don't know if it's the land itself, a curse upon the family, or something else. Did they see that black thing I was so afraid of as a kid? Was that the reason, or a symptom? I glanced down the list of things yet to try. Next up, decapitation of the corpses. I don't relish in the thought of that one. I fire off a quick text to my brother. Trouble at mill. That's the code. Code for get your shovel. We're off to dig up our old granny and grandpa again to see if we can finally get them to rest in peace like you're supposed to. The problem is, each time we try to end this and fail, every time they come back, they are more changed than before. The last time they climbed out of that grave, they looked like themselves, only dead. Upsetting, but to be expected. The nightmarish figures I've seen tonight were a world away from that. I worry we are giving them power, feeding them somehow. But we can't just let them roam free, especially when other people get caught in the crossfire. I think this is going to require some outside help. Exploring an abandoned warehouse. Sorry if this is a long post, but I needed to share this with someone. There is this abandoned warehouse in the middle of my city. Not in the middle, but in the busy part of the city. The reason nobody has done anything about it is because the warehouse used to be owned by a petroleum company. They used it to store oil before the city expanded. Now there's a flyover running over it, and the property is owned by the city and the railway commission because of the railway line that runs next to it. Anyway, it's just a building that used to be a part of a massive complex of warehouses, silos, and a factory. Now only this one building remains. A friend and I like exploring abandoned places, mainly for the experience and to imagine what it would have been like when the places were active and functioning. So we were looking for places to explore, and I had known about this location. It is quite close to where we live, so I suggested if we could explore the warehouse. My friend jumped at the chance and we set a date, Saturday morning. We decided to go early in the morning because that area is known for shady things and the nights aren't safe. It also gets busy during the midday. Anywho, we went at around 7 a.m., walked over there since it's not too far. When we reached the place, it was messy. Garbage piled up in the corner and the compound wall tagged with graffiti. We had to find a way in. As we walked around, we discovered there was no way in from the street. It was all just wall all the way down. We had to get in from the railway track. So we walked around and entered the railway tracks. From the railway tracks, you can see the flyover that runs over it and an apartment next to the warehouse. This place is in the middle of all the action, yet in its own bubble, lost to time. On the other side of the tracks is army and railway property. We eventually found a break in the wall that allowed us to enter the place. We had to hop over it, and there was an old broken freezer just lying on the ground. So people have come in here before. When we stepped in, and I kid you not, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. Yeah, it sounds cliche as hell, but I just felt something was off. I told my friend this, and she just shrugged it off, like it was no big deal. She basically said it's probably because we're trespassing and we could get caught. Inside, there were a lot of overgrown poppy plants and wild weeds just growing out of the cement. We had to trek through this brief bit of foliage, and once we did, we stepped into a compound. The compound was big, and I couldn't sense the size of it because a good amount was covered in overgrown wild foliage. But we could see the warehouse building rising over it in its imposing and dilapidated form. My friend was excited to see this. She pulled out her phone and took some pictures. I looked around, and the feeling was just getting worse. I then walked further into the compound, and that's when I saw it. On the ground, bones, like animal bones. It was a whole field of bones just strewn about on the ground. I freaked. I'm a guy who does not believe in superstition, but I do think curses and black magic and the supernatural is a possibility. So when I saw a literal compound of bones like skulls, femurs, teeth, and whole animal skeletons compounded with the feeling of intense dread and doom, a feeling that I get when someone close to me is about to die, I wanted to get out of there. I told my friend that we needed to leave. She still wanted to explore. She was walking all over the bones and kicking them around. I was watching this and getting even more scared. I asked her why there would be a whole bunch of bones here. She said she didn't know and didn't really care. Now, she doesn't believe in anything supernatural. Ghosts don't exist in her mind, and curses and black magic are just psychological sleight of hand. To be honest, I kind of think the same way, but I also don't dismiss the idea that someone can get cursed, or a place can be cursed. So for her, this is just fun. For me, terrifying. I was carefully watching my step, trying my best to avoid the bones. She was just trampling all over them. I didn't want to explore further, and she did. I somehow convinced her that we needed to leave, and she finally conceded, realizing that I was actually scared for my life. After we left and on the walk back, I realized that feeling I had got had not gone. I told her this. She said I was probably just paranoid. Funny thing, I never mentioned this earlier because I personally think it's a coincidence, but there's always that nagging feeling in the back of my mind that it's not. Now, for as long as I can remember, on some level, I have the ability to sense when someone is about to die. Like they can be healthy, young, old, or sick, but if they are about to die, I can sense it. Many times even before they realize. Like it only comes when I'm close to the person physically or interacting with them, but I have to be around and in some kind of contact with them. Basically, when I'm with them, I can't get the thought of death out of my mind. That was the feeling I was getting when I was with her and after we left. Mind you, I never got that feeling before we entered the place. No, I instantly got it after we left. I told her this, like I just told her I thought we might be cursed and that one of us is going to die. She, as usual, made a joke out of it and then semi-seriously said that I wasn't invited to her funeral if she died, but I told her that I was not going back there. She agreed, and we went back home. Cue to a few days later, we were planning to watch a movie when she suddenly canceled on me because she felt sick. That feeling had not gone. In fact, it came back stronger. She jokingly mentioned it was the curse. I just laughed, but at the back of my mind, I was wondering if it actually was. Then, a few days after that, I find out she has been admitted to the hospital. The condition was getting worse. The rest I found out from her parents because she had slipped into a coma shortly after that. The doctors were trying everything, and they couldn't figure out why she wasn't recovering. Then, One night, I was just sitting on my computer watching videos when I got the feeling again. Stronger than ever this time. Like stronger than I had ever got before. Funny thing, no one was around me and I wasn't talking to anyone either. The only thought I had was someone is going to die. I couldn't focus on what I was doing, just the thought of death. I thought I was going to die and the feeling got worse and worse. I tried to fight the feeling and shake it off, but it wouldn't go. Then suddenly it stopped, and all I could feel was sadness. I went to sleep. The next morning, I find out from my parents that my friend had passed away last night in the hospital. I've never been in that warehouse again. I explored an abandoned wing of hell. Whoever had carved the door relished in the anatomy of suffering. It was a 2-story tall slab of copper set directly into a cavern wall, its surface carved with a vast and complex bas-relief that worried the eye. A cloying, confusing mix of human bodies sprawling upwards, and a mound of naked flesh, many glancing horrified over their shoulders while fleeing something out of frame and out of sight. Thousands of them, starved and wretched with gaunt faces and sunken eyes, jutting ribs and distended bellies. There were rumors that they moved, but only when you weren't looking. Less than a week after its discovery, they brought it down with explosives. We didn't really know what we'd found at that point, although I'm sure a few of us, particularly the religious, had their suspicions. The door was wrong, all wrong. It just shouldn't have been there. Natural caverns don't go that deep in Britain, not 1,000 meters. As scientists, we should have been excited, but we all agreed the door was repulsive. Staring at it too long induced a powerful urge to leave. An ancestral memory, maybe. The same way our bodies know to avoid things that crawl and slither. Things that rot and buzz and stink of death and decay. They never told us how or why they found it, nor why the project was classified. Only that we had to figure out what was on the other side. When the charges finally blew, they went off like giant firecrackers. A string of them that ran around the gateway, one by one, deafening booms that shook the entire cavern. I was left blinking dust out of my eyes as great machines lowered the door, now free of its couplings, to the ground. Looking back, some details come easier than others. The air that wafted out was hot and dry, and I was not surprised. That seemed intuitively correct. Whether I'd admitted it to myself or not, the fact was I'd been thinking of the door as a gateway to hell, pretty much since I'd first laid eyes on it. And my mental image of hell was oddly medieval. I expected great big stone walls, something reminiscent of an ancient castle, rattling chains, the wailing of the damned, the stench of sulfur, God, even little red devils with horns and pointy tails. But I hadn't expected shelves and books. That was the first real thing we saw. Shelves lining the walls that had been dug directly into the same rock as the cavern. Shelves that rose far above our light so that when we looked up there was only darkness and dust, but no limits to the endless row and row of shelving, every last inch covered in books. There were no gaps, just dust and tattered spines of random sizes. Leather, fabric, paperback, faded pastels and gold leaf letters and alphabets both familiar and strange. And it wasn't just the walls. The floor was littered with random, head-high piles of books, all stacked up like some tired librarian had gotten fed up of finding room for them. They made a labyrinth of the place, obscuring corners and doors, and the forward team, myself included, progressed carefully along the stone passageway, listening and looking carefully for some signs that would make sense of the place. There must have been thousands of books, and that was just in the first hallway we explored. Whenever we took one out, we found paper so thin it was nearly translucent, and often inked with strange shapes and letters I couldn't recognize. Otherwise, it was gibberish. Not that we studied them too long on that first day. Whenever I took one, I returned it quickly. Lifting them up, I always had the strangest sensation that I was doing something wrong, inappropriate, and I didn't like the space they left behind on the shelves. A gap like a missing tooth, the darkness within swirling like deep waters. Safety in that place felt like an illusion, and touching the books was at risk of shattering it. I don't know how else to put it except I didn't want to do anything that might draw attention to me. It was as if we were extremely conspicuous. There were no sounds but those we made. Our own breath, our own footfalls, the shuffle and scuffle of our every movement. We could even hear each other's heartbeats, the discordant bump of several people's chests beating like a broken drum set, and every now and again, a racing, A steady increase in the beat's cadence as we turned a blind corner or lifted a book just to see what it contained, or looked up at the shadows above us. Each of us kept having false starts because there was always this expectation that you were going to see something soon, any second now, squeezed between two books or dangling overhead. It took 6 more hours before that corridor opened up, and when it did, we were dumbfounded. We emerged onto a vast and terrifying mezzanine made of ancient rock, overlooking a chasm with no visible bottom, just floor after floor filled with shelves filled with books, millions, billions, and all along those distant walls and stories were just little openings that led to more corridors like the one we just emerged from. So many that it was like staring at a roughshod beehive. To look up or down or anywhere was to be faced with more books than anyone could read in their entire lifetime. We took our first break on that mezzanine. While radios didn't go very far in that place, we had the sense to carry enough wire to allow for a hard connection. And using that, we contacted the main research site and updated them on the situation. We were to keep looking for another 6 hours and turn around. A day, no more, was the plan. Even that felt like too long. I wanted to leave. I wanted to confirm that somewhere was a doorway that would lead back to reality, because ever since I'd entered that place, it felt like I'd entered a nightmare, a place where reality was plastic. I told myself it was simply the scale of it all, the weirdness, but it was more than that. The very air down there felt thin. There were 6 of us, 3 scientists and 3 soldiers. The soldiers responded to the situation with silence and an alertness that bordered on paranoia, constantly scanning the dark with their rifle-mounted lights, flicking the beam from one high-up shelf to another, fidgeting, exchanging dark looks. In a way, I was thankful, but it put me on edge too, and I couldn't relax at all for the first half of our little break. I guess it was natural that the scientists got talking. This was partly to fill the quiet, but also partly to try and convince ourselves we were excited about the implications of this find, whatever those may be. Rewriting history, archaeology on a new level, that kind of thing. It didn't take long before we convinced ourselves to take a closer look at those books. I'll admit it didn't come easy, but we did a pretty good job of convincing ourselves that we weren't really afraid. We started slowly, taking one book down, opening and then quickly replacing it. But then, with false bravery, we took more, and more came down until each of us were sat cross-legged with several books stacked up on either side, waiting to be read. I remember at some point I must have grown tired and looked up from my own pile because I noticed Dr. Eiling muttering quietly as she traced some words with her fingers. "What have you found?" "It's the Latin alphabet," she said. "First one I actually recognized the letters for. German, maybe?" None of us were linguists, so we simply were just doing our best. But upon hearing B mention German, one of the soldiers came over and looked at the open page. "Germanic, but not German," he said. "You speak it?" He nodded. "My father is German, and I don't know what that is, but it isn't German." "Is any of it familiar?" B asked while handing the book to him. After a brief nod from his CO, Lieutenant Michael, he took it and began flicking through the pages. "I think this is the word for death. A sort of rough misspelling, maybe. This one is, I guess it's a bit like wanting, desiring. I don't know. Not all the words seem like they're in the right context either. So they're in a variety of languages and alphabets, but as of yet, nothing we can make sense of." "What about you? Any luck?" B asked me, and I looked down at the book currently open in my hands. "Some kind of Cyrillic, maybe?" I shrugged. "I'm no linguist. We definitely need Dr. Sellers in the next expedition. I'm sure he could offer some insight. What about you, Dr. Rosenstein?" The third scientist in our group, a little bald man, had been sitting quietly the entire time we spoke, frowning at one of the several books that lay open before him. I assumed he was just curious like B and I. "Grant," I said, trying to get his attention. "Hey Grant, have you found anything?" His silence unnerved me. He wasn't just captivated. Sweat was prickling his forehead and veins bulged along his temple. He had gone pale and his eyes were wide and his lips cracked and dry. The soldiers, picking up on the same strange signals I had, stood a little more upright. "Dr. Rosenstein," one of them asked, nervously. "Doctor, can you hear us?" The nearest soldier reached out and placed a hand on Grant's shoulder, and the little man looked up at us like he hadn't even realized we existed until that moment. At first I thought he was relieved the way he stared at each of us with a dumb grin on his face, but soon I realized something wasn't quite right. "Oh," he said with an anxious laugh. "Oh, right, of course." His eyes darted between us. "Of course, sorry, I didn't mean to alarm you." "Right," I said. Well, we were just talking about the books. B thinks hers might be in a kind of German or Germanic language. He nodded like this makes perfect sense. Yes, I imagine so, he replied while looking around the shelves that towered over us. Lots of languages, I'd say. And then, without really missing a beat, he added, their sins. The group fell into silence as each of us tried to make sense of what he just said. In the meantime, he stood up and stretched, like it was the most natural thing in the world. What are you on about? I said, once it became clear that he wasn't going to elaborate. It's fairly obvious where we are, he said while leaning forward and eyeing us darkly. And these books are a list of all of our sins, for each one of us. So there will be books in German, both contemporary and historic German, like the one you found, Dr. Eiling. But there will also be books in Russian and French and Arabic and Chinese, not just contemporary tongues either. Ancient Egyptian, Phoenician, Babylonian, Aramaic, Latin, and of course lost languages, ones that we never found but existed anyway. All of them. All the transgressions of the world are right here, recorded in the sinner's original tongue. By now the soldiers had stepped a little closer, and B and I were sharing deeply worried looks. Grant seemed to be in the middle of a breakdown, speaking frantically and anxiously, convinced of his own meaning while not really saying anything of sense. Grant, I think we need to go back. The real fun is that I think you'll find books in languages that don't exist yet, he blurted. This isn't just a record of sins in the past, but all of them. Every last one. Even the ones we haven't committed yet. Grant, I'm going to have one of the men go back with you, if that's okay. I think you might not... These are mine, he said, while gesturing to the book in his hand. All of them, he laughed. Not just the things I did. Petty transgressions all recorded with names and places and even little diagrams. But there were even sins I only ever thought, things I wanted to do. And, he added while giggling hysterically, sins I've yet to commit. He flicked through the pages at random and giggled maniacally at something only he could see. Although there aren't many, he cackled, as he turned to the final page, tears welling in his eyes. Just one, actually. The last one. The last sin I'll ever commit. Grant, I said. I think you... Before any of us could react, he dropped the book and took a running leap over the nearest ledge. This is the way we came, right? B stood at the threshold of a corridor, her light tracking a wire that snaked into the darkness. That's the cable we carried in with us, one of the soldiers said. But the young man looked over to his CO, Lieutenant Michael, who had a compass in his hand and didn't look happy. It's not the direction we came, the older man said. We came south, so we need to head north. That would be this doorway. He nodded at a second corridor embedded in the rock wall. This has to be the way, B said. I trust this cable a hell of a lot more than I do a compass. Anything could be interfering with that thing. Besides, we know the cable leads to headquarters because it's still working. We spoke to them only a few minutes ago via this wire. It has to lead out of here. That makes sense, I added, but I marked the way we came with a piece of chalk, and that mark is over there. I pointed to a third doorway. Fuck, Michael muttered. Regardless, I vote wire, B said. I trusted them most. It's a physical connection. I guess I vote wire too, Michael added. Me too, but what do we do if we're wrong, I asked. What does that even mean? Did something move the wire or the door? We all went silent for a few moments as we contemplated this. When nobody offered up an answer, I eventually grabbed my backpack and hauled it up. I guess we don't have much of a choice either way, I said. Do you think there's really a book in here for everyone? B asked, and it was the first any of us had spoken in a few hours. So far, we had all been walking, fixated on the gloom ahead of us and behind us, watching carefully for some sign that our fevered imaginations were right to suspect something lurking in the dark. Grant seemed to think so, I said. Then what are the odds he picked his own book out? I mean, if he's right, there are, 100 billion books or so? More, I replied. If he's right about the library containing future sins as well as past. Pretty slim odds then, she added. What are you thinking? If he did find it here, I don't think it was a coincidence. Up ahead, one of the soldiers came to a sudden stop. Fist raised, he muttered something to the others who knelt and lifted their rifles, aiming at the dark. What is it? I asked. Don't you hear it? Michael called back. All of us stopped and listened carefully, straining to pick out some meaningful sound from the white noise of blood rushing through our ears and the thumping of our own hearts. Sure enough, it was there, a gentle rustling. Without speaking, all of us moved as quietly as we could along the corridor until we came to the source of the strange noise. A door, one that hadn't been there on our way in, left ever so slightly ajar. Rifle raised, one of the soldiers used his barrel to nudge it open a little farther. "Oh shit," he said, his voice loud enough to send echoes down the hall. The sound came as a shock, and Michael pulled him back, ready to admonish, when all we saw was what had been waiting on the other side. Another corridor, only this one had shelves lined not with books, but severed heads. Desiccated, pale, and gaunt, row after row, all sitting neatly next to one another, evenly spaced. Their skin paper white in the harsh glare of the lights, and all of them with cloudy eyes. And they were speaking. Sotto voce, little whispers. They muttered in a discord of wet lips. No breath, no lungs, only the action of rubbery jaws to sound out syllables and consonants that were lost in the rustling cacophony. The sound was horrific, wet and dry and deeply disturbing. It worked its way under my skin until I felt the strangest urge to lash out at the heads. But curiosity overrode disgust, and I approached one, wincing briefly when it fixed me with its cloudy eyes, but I didn't stop. I got close enough to see every detail of its flaking skin, its rheumy eyes glaring at me with such strange emotion. For my own sanity, I reached out and picked it up, noting with disgust how the stump of its neck left mottled brown fluid on the shelf behind. I guess I just wanted to know if it was fake, but its skin was cold, and its brow furrowed with anger at my touch. And as soon as it was in the air, every other head stopped their muttering and fixed me with such foul expressions I quickly put it back down again, relieved when the murmuring resumed. Still, its eyes did not leave me. "What the fuck?" B whispered. "What is this?" Michael asked as he scanned the upper shelves with his torch. On and on they went as far as we could see. What the actual fuck is this? Slowly, a strange thought began to form in my mind. "Blink if you can understand me," I said while kneeling down to look at the head I'd picked up. Everyone else in the group suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned to see the result of my little experiment. Okay, I repeated while trying to calm myself down. "Right, once for no, twice for yes. Do you understand?" Blink, blink. "Right, okay, I looked to the others for suggestions when B piped up instead. "Are these books a list of all our sins?" Blink, blink. "One book for each person?" Blink, blink. "So what are you?" she asked, and this elicited a scathing look from the severed head. "Yes or no questions," I told her. One of the soldiers, the youngest one, the one who'd helped translate the German, stepped up and spoke. "Is this hell?" he asked. Blink, blink. "Is this your punishment?" he added. Blink. "If this isn't your punishment," he said, "what is?" All the heads stopped their muttering and began to emit the strangest noise, their faces twisting upwards and warping into grotesque parodies of joy, while their mouths moved up and down in a peculiar sort of rhythm. When I realized what they were doing, I felt a terrible sensation of cold dread creeping down my entire body. They were laughing at us. There was no door. The wire slipped through a tiny hole at the base of a wall that blocked off the corridor. All of us were stunned into silence for minutes until at last, Lieutenant Michael shook himself free from the shock and issued an order. "Davies, get HQ on the line." One of the soldiers knelt down and began to remove the communication set from his backpack. Within a few seconds, it was set up and he was speaking into the handset. "HQ, can you read me? Over." I can read you." "Well, I guess the wire still leads to HQ," I said. "Try checking the wall for seams," Michael told me. "See if it moves, hidden hinges, or something. I don't know." Then, turning back to the soldier with the handset, "Tell them we've encountered an obstacle and we want them to send another team in to get us. Oh, and tell them to bring explosives." "If this thing opens," I said, while running my hand along the edges. "I can't see how. It's pretty solid. Unlike every other wall we'd seen so far, this one was made of red bricks. But that didn't mean it was somehow mobile either. It seemed as sturdy as any brick wall I'd come across." "Well, it came from somewhere," B cried while trying to peer through the hole the wire disappeared through. "Damn it, I can't see anything." "HQ," the soldier said. "We're gonna need some assistance. There is an obstacle. Over." "Roger that. What's the obstacle?" A wall," he replied. "Tell the next team to bring explosives." Over. "A wall?" "Just send the team ASAP," the soldier cried. "Our way out is blocked." Over. Well, I can confirm we are en route to your position. Just one question, HQ replied. What's that? Over, the young man replied. Why do you keep saying over? Suddenly the voice changed. It began to titter and giggle, at first quietly, but then louder and louder, like a mean kid laughing at a prank. The cruelty in its high-pitched voice made my skin crawl, and I was about to snatch the handset myself and begin demanding answers, when there was the strangest sound. A heavy grinding, like stone turning against stone. Before I could even ask what it was, B fell backwards from where she crouched and quickly leaped up into a standing position and ran off into the dark like a maniac. The effect on the group was chilling, and I stared back at the wall, desperately trying to understand what I'd seen. Williams, go get her, he barked at one of the soldiers before turning to me and crying, What the fuck is her problem? I don't know, I stammered. Christ, Michael hissed before snatching the handset off the confused young soldier. Listen, he growled into it. I don't know who you really are, but you need to get someone in charge, right? That sound again, loud and heavy. The grinding of heavy rocks being moved, and tiny stones came raining down in a cloud of dust. Something up there had disturbed them, and we all stood in silence as they plinked off our helmets. Is it just me, Michael said while looking towards the wall, or is it somehow closer? Hard to say, I replied. The wall moved. A sudden and terrifying lurch forwards, one that startled us all and made me trip over my own feet. Terrified, I scrambled backwards from it as fast as I could while the handset continued to radiate that malicious laughter. I think we need to go, I said in as calm a voice as I could manage. The wall moved again, and this time it did not stop. The young soldier with the handset did not react fast enough. It came forward so quickly that it had him within seconds and knocked him to the floor with a heavy thump. Then it rolled over him, and it was... Well, if you're anything like me, as a child you might have wondered what happened to someone who got caught in an escalator at the very top. I'm sure you know what I mean. Light was poor, so I still don't really understand what happened. Only that there was a lot of blood, and while it was quick, it was not quick enough, because when the wall was about halfway up his spine, I could still see pain registering in his eyes. And that was the last impression I had before Michael grabbed me by the collar and practically threw me back the way we came. And then we ran, running, plodding, one foot after another. I don't know how long it went on for, but it was as if time seemed to stretch on in the way that only pain and tedium can induce. There were moments where, as I struggled to force one foot in front of the other, I wondered if I'd actually been running for days, not hours. There's no real way to mark the passage of time, only monotony. Books went by in a blur. The floor was featureless stone. The rhythmic sound of my feet lost all meaning, and behind me, the wall, ever advancing with the horrible sound of grinding rocks, promising pain and nothing else. The only thing I could actually focus on was exhaustion, and that was self-defeating. More than a few times I wondered if I should just give up, and to this day, I still have nightmares where I'm being chased down that corridor. It wasn't a quick pace, but it was quick enough, and there were no other routes except forward, and therein lay the torture of it. Behind me was death, moving at a brisk jog, and ahead of me was nothing, just darkness broken by the erratic motion of a torch. And the entire time, which I would later realize was a good 2 hours, the only thing I could think was, when am I going to lose this fight? When am I going to collapse or give up? Imagine my relief when, up ahead, I heard a familiar voice cry out, "What is your problem, lady?" And then I saw him. The young man held B by her soldiers while she tried to drag him through an open door. That was when I remembered the little corridor with the severed heads. Not exactly the kind of salvation I was hoping for, but it'd have to do. Together, Michael and I grabbed both of them and threw us all through the opening. Seconds later, far too close for comfort, the entire corridor we'd been running through went pitch black. The wall overtook our positions, and we were left panting and exhausted on the floor where thousands of severed heads looked at us in annoyance. When we looked back the way we came, we saw nothing but pulsating flesh. A wall of it, hot and sticky and threaded with sickly blue veins. I don't know what that wall was, but something about the meat behind the stone made me think of hungry coral. It was a fucking trap, Michael hissed as he inspected the horrible mess. I don't know how, but we were led down the wrong path. It swapped the cables or something. I don't know, but we were lured down there like rats. Where's Davies? The other soldier asked. He's gone, Michael said. What? The older man gestured to the wall of meat behind us. Whatever the fuck that thing is got him. It looked like a wall, but it could move and it just steamrolled him. Thanks for the warning, by the way. He growled at B, but she showed no sign of understanding him. Instead, she was sat on the floor and shaking, clearly in a state of shock. Where now, sir? The remaining soldier asked, and Michael grimaced. Where do you think? He spat before gesturing at the route forward. The only direction that's available. The heads made for strange companions. They followed us with their eyes, but did not stop their muttering. It was grating, to say the least. A noise you could ignore for maybe an hour or so, but pretty soon the papery rustle of their ancient lips was the only thing you could focus on no matter how hard you tried to push it out of your head. At least navigation was simple. Forward. Only the one way to go. We walked for about 6 hours before we took our first break. The corridor was wide, but we stayed away from the heads and slept in a row. Head to feet, while 2 of us stayed on watch. 6 hours each. I decided to stay up along with Michael as B and the other soldier tried to rest. B had barely come out of shock during the journey, speaking a little towards the very end. She told us in a broken way what she had seen while kneeling by the wall. Teeth, she said, and a face. Although she wouldn't, or couldn't, elaborate on those 2 statements. I was left with the sense that she had seen something that had come damn close to leaving her completely insane. Even as it was, I doubted she had a full recovery in her. She almost looked like a different woman, baggy-eyed, thinning hair, or maybe it was just the conditions down there. Michael didn't look great either, and I had to assume I looked pretty rough too, especially after that run. It had exhausted me, broken me. Not just the physical exertion, but the nightmare of it. The reason I'd elected to stay on watch first was because I didn't want to sleep. A part of me was worried I'd just dream about being back in that hallway, running from the moving wall, and I didn't want to revisit that place ever again, not even as a dream. There were moments where I came so close to just giving up. I don't think I'd ever really experienced despair like that before. Not the kind where you feel your knees buckling and your neck turned to rubber as your head bows. It must be what people stranded at sea feel when they lose the strength to keep treading water. So instead, I stayed up and tried to ignore the muttering of the heads. Even tried talking to Michael, but he didn't have much to say. I could tell Davies back in the corridor had bothered him. Hell, it bothered me, and I hadn't even known the guy. But I swear, to this day, I can still see the look on his face as rock met flesh, and his legs and hips just disappeared. In the end, I had only these kinds of thoughts for company, and lots of time. So it probably shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that I eventually fell asleep. But it wasn't for long, 10 minutes at most. But it was enough for me to wake up and see something drag the sleeping soldier's body into the darkness of the nearest shelf. His neck lolling unnaturally to one side. The movement was gentle, quiet, clumsy too. Like a child pulling a rag doll stealthily out of a toy box. I looked over to Michael and saw he'd fallen asleep as well, so I nudged him with my foot and he woke up with a sort of lazy start. Only when he looked at me, confused for a few short seconds before slowly registering the look of terror on my face, did he seem to realize what was happening. I'm not sure what I expected him to do, really, but he was the leader and well armed, and I didn't want to be the one who had to figure out what to do next. Possibly because there was a part of me tempted to just sneak off, to leave the young man to his fate. Maybe even be, if it just meant I could survive a little bit longer. In truth, I was relieved when Michael leapt into action immediately. I didn't want to be a coward. He jumped up and grabbed the young man's foot, and I ran over and grabbed the other leg, and together we tried to pull him back. I didn't mention it to Michael, but the way the soldier's body felt when I grabbed it, the muscles were too relaxed, too heavy. I don't know how to explain it, but if you ever end up in the unfortunate situation of moving a corpse, you might know what I mean. A living body supports itself. A dead one is just meat and water and somehow feels so much heavier for it. He was dead. Still, we fought on. At some point, B must have woken up, realized what was happening, and joined in. I remember her trying to reach into the shelf to grab a hold of the dead man's arm when she suddenly flew backwards, landing with a hefty thud against the shelves behind her. and rocking a few of the severed heads off their little stumps. Whatever was in the dark was clearly frustrated. It wanted its next meal, and it wasn't going to let us stop it. Slowly, a long, inhuman arm reached out and took hold of the body's groin. Its strange hand had fingers that split at the knuckle 1, 2, 3 times. A terrifying effect, especially given how each one moved on its own. A dinner plate monster of a hand attached to a lithe and muscular forearm devoid of hair. The second I saw it reach out in my general direction, I let go of the leg and fell backwards. Michael continued struggling for a while, even taking out a pistol and firing a few shots into the dark. But in doing so, he left only hand to cling onto his comrade's corpse and lost his grip. With almost no effort, the body disappeared into the shadow, and we were suddenly down to 3. "What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?" he screamed. I wanted to say something, maybe even something to comfort him, or maybe an apology for falling asleep, but then again, he'd fallen asleep too. I didn't know what I was meant to do. I was in shock, and it was settling deep into me when Bee said something from where she remained on the floor. Her voice quiet, but oddly insistent. "It isn't over." That hand re-emerged. Carefully, deliberately, it placed itself on the floor, revealing more of the pale flesh that powered it. And then came another, and then its head emerged slowly from the dark and fixed me with eyes both black, bulbous, and far too numerous for anything that can be called human. And its mouth? A beard made of dirty fingers. Gray and bluish, long rancid nails, hundreds of them squirming like the mandibles of a hungry spider. Michael opened fire, but he might as well have been shooting hay for all the effect it had. The bullet struck with a wet thwop, but no actual damage. The creature knocked him aside with pure contempt and pulled the rest of itself out into the corridor where it saw it had no legs, but instead relied on several long arms to suspend itself between the walls of the corridor like a kind of spider. One of these arms reached out and grabbed Bee, and by the time she started screaming, it was already too late. Blood trickled from her ears, and there was a sound like a branch snapping. Her entire body went limp, and the monster dropped her, where she fell to the ground, her grotesque, misshapen face glaring at me with accusatory eyes. The lieutenant screamed as he fired yet again, but then that thing seized him like he was nothing but a doll and lifted him. Squeezing so tightly, he dropped everything he held. His gun and torch hitting the ground with a loud rattle. "Help me!" he screamed, while reaching out for me to grab him. "Jesus Christ, shoot the fucking thing!" I ran forward, crouching down in the hope of avoiding its many arms. Already, Michael was being squeezed so tight that blood spurted from his mouth, and I could tell that the monster was having fun, reveling in his torment. I reached out to pick the gun up from the floor as Michael let out yet another desperate, wet cry for help. But for some reason, my hand stopped mere inches away. I hesitated. Michael's blood was dripping down. I could hear the crunching of his ribs. In my most shameful moment, I grabbed the torch and ran. And Michael's cries followed me, screaming, screeching, whimpering, sounds of breaking bones and tearing paper. Sounds of torture and torment that somehow seemed to last forever. I emerged from the corridor alone. It took me a few seconds of stumbling on my failing legs to realize that the monster had given up on the pursuit, and then a few seconds more for me to recognize I was back on the mezzanine, terrified and exhausted, and contemplating if it was worth trying to escape if it meant having to spend another second alive in that place. I fell to the floor and began to sob. Maybe, I thought, it was time to take a dive off that ledge just like Grant had. "What on earth are you doing here?" I whipped around to see an old man in robes staring at me like an impolite intruder. Without meaning to, I began to laugh. My sanity, it was fair to say, was on its final legs. "Humph," he said, while leaning aside to get a look down the long corridor behind. "Now why did you go down there?" I wanted to answer but couldn't quite bring myself to do anything except laugh and gasp for air. "I think you really ought to go home," he said, like a teacher admonishing a child. "This place is hell," I cried while rocking back and forth on my knees. "Yes," he nodded. "Yes, good for you. This is a small part of hell, one that has a slight overlap with Earth, if I remember. I'm assuming that's how you got down here, that door. What happened to your friends anyway?" he added. I looked back the way I came and pointed. "Oh," he sighed. "You know, I left your books out specifically so you'd find them and figure it out. And I know that bald fellow worked it out. So once you knew this place was hell, why did you waste another second sticking around?" I shrugged, not quite sure what I was meant to say to that kind of thing. "We got waylaid," I gasped. "Misled." "Fair enough," he replied. "Probably should have done more to make sure you got home safely. That's partly my fault. Although I won't apologize. You entered this place. Didn't you see the door? What part of that was inviting? You have to take some of the blame." I wanted to mount a defense, but I didn't really have one. When it became clear the only thing I could do was sob and mutter, the old man's body language softened and he reached a hand out. "Come on, I'll take you back." "What about the demons?" I asked. The old man frowned. "Those weren't demons," he snapped. "This place is defunct. Mortal souls were meant to demonstrate repentance by wandering the near eternal halls in search of their book. Only when they found it were they allowed to move on. Whole thing didn't quite work out. 86 quadrillion books. Takes a tad too long for the average person to find theirs. So this entire wing was abandoned and now there were only sinners left behind." "That thing was never human," I cried while pointing at the corridor I'd emerged from. "Nobody's soul looks human," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Least of all, this sort of person who gets sent to hell. This isn't a place for people who eat meat on a Friday or covet their neighbor's ox. It's for the cruel and malicious. Cowards and opportunists. A lot of people in this place have souls that have more in common with anglerfish or trapdoor spiders and their fellow man. And it's not a condition that gets better after several thousand years, either. The soul changes, twists, and so do their physical forms." "And what about you?" I said as I reached up and took his hand. "Why do you look so normal?" "Oh," he said as he helped me up. "That's because I built this place." And the last thing I can remember as he gripped me by the shoulder was the sudden and painful sensation of heat. We woke up in our respective quarters. We. All 6 of us. I still don't fully remember the mechanics. I tried asking the others how they made it back, but they weren't in a state to answer questions. B was catatonic, screaming and clutching her head in the hospital like she still remembered the way that thing crushed her skull like a grapefruit. The soldier who fell to the wall was left paraplegic even though medical tests couldn't identify a single reason why. Psychological, they said. The other soldier, the one who'd been dragged into the shelves, was comatose. I don't know if he recovered, but he was alive. And Grant was left in a permanent psychotic state, compelled to write on any surface he could over and over again. Sin after sin, desperately trying to rewrite the very book that had driven him to madness in the first place. Michael tried very hard to kill me. He had clear memories of being left to die in the dark. I'm glad they caught him before he managed to wring the life out of me with his bare hands. I never found out what happened to him after several men managed to pry his hands from around my throat. Despite everything, I hope he managed some kind of recovery. The door disappeared, thankfully with no one on the other side. I know they were planning future expeditions. It's for the best that kind of thing can't happen again. They have no idea what's waiting for them. In a way, I probably could have convinced myself the expedition never happened. Some days, even now, that's what I sincerely hope can happen. There was no physical evidence, nothing. We appeared in our beds completely naked, save for a note stuck to my chest. And it's this final little touch that stood out to me as a stern confirmation of everything I'd experienced. Return to sender. 6 mortals, 5 were damaged in transit. Bodies were repaired to the best of my ability, but I never was any good at that kind of thing. Minds are another matter entirely. Could not help myself in one case. Left fellow mortal to die in the dark. Didn't seem very sporting. Don't let anyone say I lack a sense of humor. Otherwise, no harm, no foul. Best wishes. Me. My heart sank when I heard them read it to me. It confirmed my deepest worry. No one had been very honest with me since I'd arrived at the hospital. They kept me bandaged up so it wasn't easy to tell, but after I heard that note, I finally found the courage to reach up and remove the thick wads of fabric. Then, with shaking fingers, I finally touched my eyes, or rather, the empty sockets where they used to be.